we want to take full advantage of the full hour here. And seeing as how it's 10 o'clock, we're going to go ahead and get started. So simmer down out there. And I am Ted Kyle, and I'm the outsider here, but a deep admirer of Obesity Canada, and wouldn't miss this meeting for the world. So I just want to thank the organizers for inviting me to chair this with the executive director of Obesity Canada, Jimena Ramos-Salas, who is just part of an amazing team. And we're here for a mini review on weight bias, and I am going to get right to it and introduce Angela Alberga, who is an assistant professor at her alma mater in the Department of Health, Kinesiology, and Applied Physiology at Concordia. Her research focuses on better understanding how societal, school, and other institutional factors influence weight-related issues, and I think you'll find that she has some really wonderful things to say about internalized weight bias. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Alberga.
Thank you, Ted. Okay, so welcome everyone. Good morning. Thank you very much for that warm introduction. I feel honored to be introduced by two of my very esteemed colleagues, so thank you for chairing this. And I look forward to speaking to you today about internalized weight bias and how that actually affects healthy behaviors. So first, I actually got this idea from my colleague, Ted Kyle, because when he spoke about disclosures, he often speaks about personal biases first, and I thought that was a great idea. And I thought I should also discuss my own personal biases. So personally, I have not lived with obesity, but I have worked with several people living with obesity, including adults and children and adolescents. So I don't have lived experience with obesity. I think it's important to disclose that so there's self-reflection and awareness about our own personal biases. But my other personal bias is that I really do believe that weight bias is harmful, and I believe in evidence-based science to actually reduce weight bias, stigma, and discrimination in society, especially in education, in healthcare, and in public policy. And of course, these are my funding resources. So I think most people in the room probably know already about the prevalence of weight bias, stigma, and discrimination in society. And the Obesity Canada Society, the organization here, actually produced a really nice infographic displaying the different prevalence rates of weight bias, stigma, and discrimination in different sectors of society. So we know it's prevalent in education, we know it's prevalent in the healthcare system, we know it's very prevalent in the media, where we see stigmatizing images and videos all the time in various different news sources and even on social media. And we also know that weight bias, stigma, and discrimination is prevalent in the employment sector as well, where people living with obesity may actually get reduced wages because they're living in a larger body. So these are prevalence statistics that are occurring in every sector of society today. Now, what's important to understand are the definitions between weight bias, stigma, and discrimination. They do differ slightly, and I'm going to discuss them a little bit so that we can understand the difference between these and also with weight bias internalization. So when we think about bias, bias is really the negative attitudes we have about people living with obesity. So either we dislike them or we feel that they should be blamed for their own weight. And then there's the stigma, which is much more the stereotypes associated with those negative attitudes. So believing that someone living with obesity is lazy, is lacking willpower, is not physically active, pursues a lot of sedentary behaviors. And then there's the discrimination piece, which is much more the behavioral component of bias and stigma. So if you actually treat someone differently because of their weight, that's actually a form of discrimination. This can be overt, it can be subtle, but it's really the behavioral form of these two definitions. Now, when we talk about weight bias internalization, this is a different concept and a much newer concept actually in literature today. We do know that weight bias internalization is more of that self-stigma, where it's self-disparagement based on identifying with those social discrimination that's viewed in society. So essentially, it's that self-stigma and believing that stigma is really true about yourself. When you're actually taking those stereotypes, applying them to yourselves, and actually feeling that you deserve to be treated differently because of your weight. So it's really quite different from the other terms, but this is really what I'm going to be focusing on today, is about weight bias internalization and how this can particularly be really problematic, that can influence our healthy behaviors and even weight management. So these are some examples of a weight bias internalization scale, and these are questions that are usually asked of participants to understand how high or how low their weight bias internalization is. So one of these subscales is I hate myself for my weight. Another one is I am less attractive than most other people because of my weight. I feel anxious about my weight because of what people might think of me. And whenever I think a lot about my body weight, I feel depressed. So these are common beliefs. If someone has a lot of weight bias internalization, they'll typically score high on this scale. And values on these actually suggest that there can be associated problems with healthy behaviors and how they perceive themselves and how you believe these stigma to be true about yourself and about your weight. What's really interesting too is that weight bias internalization doesn't just exist amongst people living with obesity. We actually find that weight bias internalization exists across the weight spectrum, across people with lower BMIs, higher BMIs, across the entire spectrum. So this is a really interesting concept that's applicable to not only people living with obesity, but people living in smaller bodies as well. I'd like to show a video here that actually shows a nice clip to understand what it really feels like to experience weight bias internalization. Does anyone here watch This Is Us?
Yes.
Okay, quite a few of you do, I figured. So this is actually an excerpt from the audition from Christy Metz before This Is Us. If you can play the video, thank you.
This whole dream life that I envisioned for myself. A real career. I would marry a man like Dad. I would be a mom like Mom. But look at me, Kev. Like I ate my dream life away.
Part of the magic of that show. Chrissy Metz auditioned for This Is Us with that scene right there.
Thank you. So this is just an example of when you believe the stereotypes to be true about yourselves, you feel like you may actually not be able to succeed romantically, you may not be able to succeed in your job, and it's mainly due to those social stereotypes that you endorse for yourself and you self-stigmatize and believe that you can't advance in society because of your weight. And this is just a good example, and This Is Us is a show that actually talks quite a bit about weight stigma and weight bias internalization. So what we do know already, there's been a lot of literature to date already on weight stigma itself, not so much on weight bias internalization, but the health consequences of just being stigmatized. And this is a really nice schema that was produced by our esteemed colleague in the US, Rebecca Pull, who's really the leader in this field. And when you experience weight bias and stigma, you actually experience a form of stress. And that stress may actually have more consequences on your eating and physical activity behaviors, where you may tend to avoid exercise, you may tend to binge eat to cope with your emotions. And there may be other forms that you can actually incorporate in your life because of that stigma that you're experiencing. There may also be responses through your physiology. There's actually been studies that looked at increased cortisol, because of the stress hormone that you're experiencing, the anxiety that you're experiencing, depressive symptoms that are associated with that stress and that stigma, and even a response on healthcare services. So people may actually avoid the healthcare system if they feel stigmatized by their healthcare provider, whether that may be a physician, a nurse, a physiotherapist, a dietitian, and that may actually ensue further weight gain. And from further weight gain may actually ensue more psychological issues such as anxiety, depression, suicidal tendencies, etc., and may also have more responses on your physiology as well. So it's a really complex relationship, and this has actually been shown quite a bit in the literature. This is something we know already. There's been extensive evidence on this, and this is a nice review that summarizes all those types of health consequences. What we know less about, though, is the health consequences of weight bias internalization. So far, if you take a look at this graph, Rebecca Pearl and Rebecca Pull actually published a systematic review on weight bias internalization. And they actually want to show the differences in publications that started off. Really, the first publication on weight bias internalization started in 2008. And then there was many more publications that ensued after that. But if you notice from this graph, you'll notice that it was really in the last 5 to 10 years that more of the publications came out on weight bias internalization and its relationship with health. This is the systematic review that I was just mentioning, and I'll be summarizing quite a bit of the literature that was just done because this was actually just published in 2018. So if anyone would really like a really thorough review on this topic, I would really highly recommend this paper. It really synthesized a lot of the evidence to date that we know about weight bias internalization in health. So what we do know and what the systematic review found is that weight bias internalization is actually associated with mental health outcomes. And this has actually been pretty well studied thus far. I'll mention some of the study limitations a little bit later, but what we do know is that with higher weight bias internalization, we tend to have more scores of depression and anxiety. It tends to be related to greater negative emotions and negative affect, and more eating disorder symptoms and binge eating disorder. So there's been association, cross-sectional studies that have shown this quite a bit in the literature to date. We do know that higher weight bias internalization is also significantly associated with lower self-esteem and lower quality of life. Now the evidence here, I'm speaking more about weight bias internalization and physical health. We know less about these relationships. So the relationships that I'm mentioning here on this slide have actually been published with fewer studies, many cross-sectional studies, many subjective measures, unfortunately, to date. But we do need more research on this topic to understand the implications of weight bias internalization on our physical health and our physiological health. But what we do know so far, we've seen a couple of studies that actually associate weight bias internalization with lower overall physical activity, measured by self-report questionnaire, lower enjoyment of physical activity, lower exercise motivation, a higher resting heart rate, and even an association with risk factors for the metabolic syndrome. So these are more preliminary data that are coming out about physical health, but we at least have an idea that they are associated with negative symptoms and signs of physical health. This was an interesting study here that actually showed differences when they classified people with low stigma and high stigma. So this was a sample of adults, and what they did was they really wanted to look at avoidance of exercise in a sample of adults living with obesity. And they actually classified people in lower stigma using an explicit weight bias questionnaire and another category of higher stigma. And you'll see here, what they also want to look at is they want to see how weight bias internalization actually affects this relationship. So if you take a look at this graph, you'll notice that people on the solid bar with high weight bias internalization actually tend to avoid exercise more. And this was especially prevalent in the high stigmatizing group. But what's mostly interesting here is that even if you have weight bias and you've experienced weight bias, if you internalize weight bias, it tends to be worse for your physical health. So these actually were controlled for age, sex, and BMI as well. So it's interesting that these relationships are still prevalent, even those controlled for BMI. If you take a look at this graph here, you'll also notice this was another study that was published looking at weight bias experiences and how that relates to weight bias internalization and exercise behavior. And you'll see here that more weight stigma experiences, so the more you actually experience weight stigma in your daily life, whether that be in the public, in the healthcare system, in education, the more experiences you have of being stigmatized about your weight, the more you tend to internalize weight bias. The more you tend to internalize weight bias, that will actually tend to affect your exercise behavior. I'm an exercise physiologist by training, so I really found a lot of these values really interesting. And these studies really warrant further study to really understand these complex relationships, because if we know that we experience weight bias and those experiences increase, we tend to internalize them more. That can really affect our healthy behaviors and our pursuit of physical activity and exercise behavior. Now, I do have to mention some study limitations. So the two Rebeccas actually summarized this really quite nicely in their systematic review. And they found that, unfortunately, although there's been 74 studies to date that were actually included in this systematic review, most of them included samples of women, most of them included samples of Caucasian women, and also most of them were cross-sectional. So we really do need a lot more evidence on longitudinal studies, very well-controlled studies. We do need more RCTs to understand this relationship better and how we can actually reduce weight bias internalization. And we need more diversity in culture and sex and ethnicity in our samples to really understand this better. What we have done so far in my lab, and my graduate students are actually sitting right here, a lot of them have actually done a lot of this work. So I'd like to thank them for the work that they've done here. We do some work at the Perform Center along with one of my collaborators, Dr. Lisa Kakinami, and we collected data from a sample of 175 adults, and we actually managed to have almost a half-half sample of women and men. So that was pretty good so far to address at least one of the study limitations that we have. And we also had a sample just of adults, middle-aged, and a BMI that was an average of about overweight. And what we did was we wanted to understand the relationship between weight bias internalization and some measures of mental health. And what we see here is for every unit increase in weight bias internalization, we see that life satisfaction, positive emotions, and body satisfaction decreased. So this is a cross-sectional study again, but we do actually have longitudinal data of 1-year follow-up that we're going to be analyzing soon, and we will be putting this into a manuscript shortly. We also looked at relationships with sex. So when we stratified by sex, we actually wanted to see what happens to weight bias internalization. And interestingly, these relationships were all found in women, but in men, there was no relationship with weight bias internalization and positive emotions, but there was a relationship for life satisfaction. So we do have lots more research to do on this topic to really understand it better. We need more robust studies to actually understand these relationships, especially over the long term. One of my graduate students actually sitting here will be presenting about sedentary behavior. So I'm not going to steal his thunder. He will be speaking a little bit later. So if you really want to know the relationship between weight bias internalization and sedentary behavior, I encourage you to go to his talk. So we have lots of other data that really need to be studied better. And that's more about pre and post bariatric surgery, if that changes with weight bias internalization. We need to better understand sex differences. We need to understand ethnic and cultural differences, coping strategies with weight bias internalization. We need better interventions. Like I mentioned, there was actually only one RCT that looked at differences between weight bias internalization pre and post a psychological intervention with weight management strategies. So we need to understand that better. And of course, we still need longitudinal studies. So stay tuned for our group publication that should come out soon about the follow-up data that we have from our sample of adults looking at 1-year follow-up and weight bias internalization. Now, of course, I always have to conclude a talk on weight bias internalization with practical suggestions because we'd like to leave the room here making an impact on society and in our everyday lives. So what I encourage you to do is really do a self-reflection and awareness. Because I mentioned that weight bias internalization can actually occur with any body shape and size, it's important to be aware of our own internalized beliefs because that may actually affect our own behaviors and may actually affect the way we engage and interact with people, our clients, our patients, and our colleagues. So this is actually a measure, this is a different measurement of weight bias, but it's a publicly accessible tool to actually assess our implicit, more unconscious weight bias attitudes. So I encourage you to take a look at that. That would be a stepping stone, or at least a first step of self-reflection to really understand better our weight bias implicitly. We want to avoid making assumptions because one thing that we know is that weight bias and stigma and discrimination is really prevalent. We don't want to add to that and assume that they actually don't internalize their own weight bias as well. Weight bias is really quite prevalent as well. We want to be able to assess weight bias internalization in ourselves and in our clients. These are two tools that are commonly used. So if you're interested in using these tools, I'd recommend for you to take a look at them as well. And lastly, I cannot conclude without mentioning advocacy as well. Obesity Canada has been really great for this. It would be important for all of us to be advocates for ourselves and also for our patients and our clients. If we do recognize that there is weight bias in our institution and our practices and our healthcare system, it's important to speak up and do something about it. And lastly, of course, I have to thank my lab. My students are sitting here actually right now, some of them anyway, who do a lot of this great work with me, and I'm fortunate to work with them. And these are just some of my funders. And I'd like to thank the organizing committee for allowing me to speak, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Angela. And good morning, everyone. My name is Jimena Ramos Salas, and I'm the Executive Director of Obesity Canada. And it's my pleasure to introduce my other colleague from the Everybody Matters Collaborative, Dr. Sara Kirk, who is a professor of health promotion at Dalhousie University and scientific director of the Healthy Populations Institute. Her research focus is really exploring the creation of supportive environments for chronic disease prevention through healthy eating and physical activity. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Kirk.
Good morning, everyone. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. Thank you for joining us this morning on this session on weight bias. It's my pleasure to be presenting to you today on some work that we've been doing at Dalhousie University, as well as to give you an understanding of the state of the literature in the field of interventions to reduce weight bias among healthcare provider trainees. Whoops, I'm just going to get this working. Here we go. I really love the slide that Angela just put up about her own personal biases, and I would like to echo what she said. And also just note that for what I'm presenting today, there are no personal conflicts to disclose, although I do receive funding for aspects of my research. A lot of what I'm going to present today is work that's actually unfunded. And in fact, it's part of my contribution, if you like, to the work that we do as the Everybody Matters Collaborative. And so you will have seen signs around, and some of you will have been here yesterday for one of the workshops where the Everybody Matters Collaborative was introduced and shared some work. Really what we're involved in is sharing evidence and best practices in reducing weight bias and stigma, and looking at it across multiple sectors: education, healthcare and public policy, and really trying to move towards some of that consensus that we need around what are the messages that we should be putting out there, how should we be addressing weight bias and stigma in these multiple settings. The objectives of my session today are to review the evidence for the effectiveness of weight bias reduction interventions, and specifically among healthcare trainees. I'm also going to draw a lot on Angela's work, the previous speaker, because she actually led one of the most recent reviews on this topic. I'm going to look at the core components of effective weight bias reduction interventions, and specifically, again, looking at that among healthcare trainees, and suggest some of the ways forward for actually addressing this in the future. I just want to do a quick show of hands, though, as to how many of you in the room are healthcare trainees, so you're actually in a training program, whatever that may be. Okay, so a few of you. And how many of you in the room actually train healthcare trainees, so the actual people who are delivering training programs? Okay. And of those of you who put your hands up then, how many of you incorporate anything about weight bias reduction into your work? Okay. As usual, preaching to the converted. But again, as I think has already been mentioned by Angela, we really are the advocates for this sort of work. And so although you are the usual suspects in the room, this is really a call to action for you as well, to actually move forward with this and make sure that you are telling your colleagues who perhaps are not as enlightened on the need for this work. And I'm starting with this as the endpoint to which we're all working towards. So people with obesity have the right to be treated with respect when seeking healthcare. If you don't believe in that, come see me afterwards. But we know from multiple sources that the healthcare system is failing people with obesity, not just in Canada, but across the world. However, one of the things that we also know from the clinical practice guidelines released in 2006, 72 recommendations within these guidelines. One of those recommendations was around healthcare health professional training. And weight bias is really only incorporated into one chapter of those original guidelines. And they came out just before I moved to Canada, actually. And so they really framed the work that I did in my early days at Dalhousie around sort of understanding how weight is managed within the healthcare system, particularly in Nova Scotia. Fast forward a decade, and not a great deal has changed. So we know, again from research that we've done, that we're not actually implementing those guidelines from 2006 particularly well, in fact, if at all. We know from the report card that came out of the last Obesity Summit that treatment and management for people with obesity is suboptimal. And sadly, we also know from yesterday and the new report that just came out that it's not actually any better. So this is a systemic issue that we need to be addressing. When I read back the chapter on that featured weight bias, sort of management of obesity in the original guidelines, I was actually quite struck by how individual focused the language was in those times, and how little we kind of considered some of those structural elements that are preventing us from moving forward in this area. And sometimes I get a bit depressed, I will admit, that this is so hard to change. We really do have a long way to go, even though many great things have been happening. And so what I'm going to focus on today, as I say, is to really drill down to those elements of the healthcare provider and their relationship, and how we actually improve the management and or the understanding of obesity management within those providers, those trainees that we're dealing with. I do this because I come from an institution that actually has a strong focus on healthcare provider training. We have a medical school, we train occupational therapists, physiotherapists, nurses, social workers, etc. We have in the same town other institutions training dietitians and other healthcare practitioners. And we also have a strong focus at Dalhousie that again we see elsewhere in Canada on interprofessional education. So we actually have around 1,000 students going through who have to gain credit in interprofessional education. So they're actually mandated to do courses that encourage them to work together as an interprofessional team. So it provides a really great opportunity and a good sample for doing that sort of work. So healthcare trainees is a point of intervention. So why is this important? Well, as we've just seen, there is a limited change in health system structures or health professional practice in terms of improving healthcare provider management of obesity. And we know, again, from research that I've done and my colleagues have done, that healthcare provider-client relationship is compromised when we have those weight-biased attitudes. We know also that the education and training of health professionals needs to address those biases, because if we don't do that, then we're not going to see any changes moving forward. And we also know of the importance of working within that interprofessional environment. So I mentioned that a lot of this actually is based on, a lot of my presentation is based on the work that Angela and her colleagues have done. In 2016, they published one of only a few systematic reviews on weight bias reduction in health professionals. And through that review, they had identified 17 interventions to reduce weight bias. But what they found, and as Angela's already mentioned today, there's often a lot of limitations in the research that's out there. Methodological weaknesses such as short assessment times. There's a lack of randomization, if indeed it is in the format of a sort of randomized controlled trial. Often a lack of a control group, quite often small sample sizes, and a lack of long-term or longitudinal data on the outcomes of interest. So, we have an imperfect evidence base, it's fair to say. However, what I really loved about this review is that, and a previous one by Lee and colleagues in 2014, was that it really kind of highlighted these 4 paradigms in which we're operating in terms of weight bias reduction interventions. So these 4 are manipulating beliefs about the causality or controllability of obesity. So that's really about providing some of those facts to really promote an understanding that obesity is complex, it's a chronic disease, really sort of framing it away from that kind of, the way that the public generally feels, which is that it's, under individual control, it's, all you need to do is eat less and move more. It looks at modifying those social consensus and norms. So that's things like harnessing the power of influential and trusted leaders in changing those perspectives. Counter-conditioning is the third paradigm, which is around interacting with individuals with lived experience to promote self-awareness. So actually having that experience of talking to somebody who has issues with their weight can really help frame and shape people's attitudes towards people living with obesity. And finally, evoking empathy, so actually highlighting those lived experiences and enabling people to sort of better understand the sort of the aspects of living in larger bodies. Ideally, those four paradigms should be combined, so that's why there's a little circle there to sort of show, but again, there's actually quite limited information on those combined paradigms. So what we can conclude from the existing, relatively sort of limited literature is that actually existing weight bias reduction approaches do show small but positive impact on attitudes among healthcare trainees. So they are having some desired impact. And that those combined approaches actually would or do seem to offer greater benefits than just focusing on a single paradigm. But we do have a lack of data within the interprofessional education settings. And one of the things that when you read the studies that are covered in the review is that often those healthcare trainees are not actually intentionally recruited to be participants in a weight bias reduction intervention. So often they're kind of random people who, and certainly in one study, just people who happen to be wandering around a college campus get pulled in to participate in this research. We're quite, we're quite sort of opportunistic in our approaches often in academia towards, here's a sample, let's use them, rather than actually really looking at it as an intentional way of changing beliefs and attitudes amongst the people who are going to be working in the system in the future. And so I wanted to just introduce you, some of you may have heard me present before on the work that we've been doing using arts-based innovation within a sort of a weight bias reduction model. So we have really designed this, I wouldn't say in fact it was an intentional approach to begin with, but I would say that it has become more intentional as time has gone on, so that we really are trying to look at, we're using a research-informed arts-based intervention. So we took data from a previous study, we incorporated that into a dramatic presentation, we incorporated the dramatic presentation into a workshop, and then we have subsequently, based on Angela's work, really looked at making sure that we're incorporating those combined elements of those four paradigms that she identified in her research. And so there's the empathy is evoked through drama. We have the interprofessional focus, building social consensus. When we bring interprofessional trainees together in a room, and so far we've trained about 1,200 students using this workshop. What we find is that there are some disciplines that are streets ahead of others in terms of understanding the importance of equity and social justice, and so those people in the room can actually really help to shape the conversation. So using those as the kind of thought leaders, if you like, and we provide information through sort of didactic kind of methods around the controllability of obesity, but we also provide opportunities for the students to discuss and challenge some of the views that are in the room. And we have incorporated counter-conditioning through those lived experiences that we've found through our research. So we've pilot tested this. It was intentionally selected preclinical populations. So these are people who have to do this training in order to get academic credit within the system at Dalhousie's interprofessional education program. And so that allows us to be very strengths-based. And one of the things that we've done is really getting the population to think about themselves as a solution to this as well. So not just teaching them about the issue, but actually getting them to be part of the solutions to moving forward. What we've found so far is significant reductions in anti-fat attitudes pre and post exposure to the workshops. Unfortunately, we still don't have longer term data on these students. We found modest but significant improvement in interprofessional education effectiveness scores, but current attitude measures that we're using are problematic. If any of you are using the anti-fat attitude scales that are out there at the moment, they are terribly biased, I find, and I wish we had something better. And we also have found that timing of the intervention is very important as well. So we tend to have the best sort of opportunity to access first-year students, but they're probably not the best in terms of having experience clinically, and when we think actually maybe second or even third year would be better. So more needs to be done, of course. I'm an academic, we're always going to say that, but we do need those larger scale, pragmatic, randomized controlled trials with longer follow-up, and we're seeking funding for that now. And we need to embed lived experiences in all aspects of our design, delivery, and evaluation of interventions. We need so much more intentionality than exists currently in our healthcare provider training. If we can get a better measure of attitudes, please. That's another great project that needs to happen, using that person-first respectful language. I just want to, again, kind of take us back to that original comment about people with obesity have a right to expect that, respectful care. I think that means no exceptions, because everybody matters. And I just want to acknowledge my colleagues at Dalhousie, Megan Aston, Sherry Price, and Megan Sim, and trainees, Christina Awad, Terry Fimbo, Jeff Lebrun, and Joshua Youssef, who have been helping with this work. And finish off with my references. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. They just make our job so easy. I just give her 1 3-minute thing, and it's like, okay. Okay, so it's my pleasure now to introduce yourself to our third speaker. Her name is Maria Ricupero, and she's a registered dietitian and certified diabetes educator. She has a Master's of Health Science degree in Nutrition Communication from Ryerson University. And she currently works, she has worked at the University Health Network in the Cardiac Prevention and Rehabilitation Program, and more recently as a practice leader for the Endocrine and Mental Health Program. So please welcome Ms. Ricupero to the podium.
Well, good morning, everyone. I have to say it is both a pleasure and an extreme honor to be here today to talk to you about how health at every size can inform and contribute to advancing healthy public policy. And I do want to say it is a great honor and a pleasure to be on the same panel as these folks here. Yeah. The women's rights movement, the campaign to end the stigmatization against people living with HIV, AIDS, and Mothers Against Drug Drivers. These are all examples of grassroots movements that have been successful at implementing and changing public policy. Why and how were they said to be so successful? Because the public recognized the need to address the stigmatization, the injustice, the bias, and the discrimination that people were facing. I have no conflicts of interest, but similar to what's been shared earlier, I do want to highlight that I live with many privileges, as many of us in the audience do. And that is, I am white, I am educated, I am cisgendered, able-bodied, and I'm thin. The experience of living in a thin body is very different from living in a body that is larger. And as was already mentioned, I too want to echo the fact that it's very important to recognize these disparities because we live in a society where there are inequities. And this transfers into our healthcare system and how people are treated, the care that they receive, and the quality of care that they receive, whether or not they receive that. And so by highlighting this, again, recognizing the prejudice and the discrimination that people living in a higher weight body experience is the main reason why the Health at Every Size movement exists, and that too is an example of a grassroots movement. The objectives for today are to identify the principles that define health at every size, to recognize the problems with current health messaging, and then finally to demonstrate how implementing these HAES principles can help to advance healthy public policy. I'm not sure how many people are familiar with the Health at Every Size movement, so I've basically have introduced them already, but I do want to give you a little bit more background because Health at Every Size, or HAES, really consists of a group of academics, researchers, clinicians, and activists that primarily reside in Canada, the US, the UK, and Australia. They also exist because the current approach to weight loss is not effective long-term. And HAES practitioners believe that the focus on weight is causing both physiological and psychological harm. HAES practitioners follow and are committed to a set of guidelines or principles. And those are highlighted for if anybody wants to read in more detail on the Association for Size, Diversity, and Health. That website is shared with you at the bottom of my slides there, which I think will be shared with you at the end. But essentially, these principles include weight inclusivity, where body shapes, all body shapes and sizes are respected and accepted. There's a real commitment to ensuring that there are equities being delivered so that everyone, particularly marginalized groups who face oppression, have equal access, not just to healthcare, but other aspects in society. HAES practitioners do a lot of work. And whether you identify as being HAES or not, I recognize there are many people in this room at this conference that are doing a lot of work to raise awareness around bias, discrimination, with the intent to end discrimination, particularly around weight. And the approach to healthy living and active, which includes a healthy diet and active and exercise, essentially, is a holistic approach that HAES adopts and wishes to implement. And so there's a big component also on focusing in on self-acceptance. I want to point out, because I think there's a misconception out there with HAES that HAES practitioners avoid talking about weight, they ignore it, and they don't want to have anything to do with weight and the number on the scale. And that's not entirely true. As a HAES practitioner, I talk about weight all the time with people, and I don't think it serves anybody well to ignore the conversation. So I want to highlight that HAES isn't against weight loss, but it is against the focus on weight. Big difference. HAES's mission is to change the culture around how we see fat bodies instead of trying to change people's bodies. What you see here are citations from systematic reviews from various authors looking at a non-diet, weight-inclusive, weight-neutral approach and the impact or the outcomes that these have on both physiological and psychological parameters. The next slide just summarizes basically what we know from this literature. Weight-neutral, non-diet approaches are clinically and statistically associated with improvements both in physiological measures, which include blood pressure, lipids, blood glucose. In terms of health behaviors, people's intake of fruits and vegetables have increased, as well as activity levels. And when it comes to psychosocial domains, mood, anxiety, self-esteem, and body image have all improved as well compared to traditional approaches to weight loss, where they actually worsened. These studies, like in all studies, are not without their limitations. And so I want to highlight, too, that it's very difficult to get funding in this area of research because, well, it's just not available. And so the authors recognize that there are several clinical and methodological, there's a great deal of heterogeneity. And because of that, it's very difficult to conduct you can't conduct meta-analysis, but a more qualitative assessment of the results have been provided. So more specifically, some of the limitations include the fact that when it comes to non-diet approaches, there really is no standard definition of what that means. And when you look at the studies that I've highlighted here, there are some varying definitions and approaches. So it's very hard to compare, as well as some of the measurement tools that were used, again, making it difficult to draw a comparison or direct comparisons. Studies have short duration in terms of follow-up, the longest being 2 years, and the sample sizes are also quite small. And similar to what we've heard already, participants largely involved white, female, middle-aged, not living with chronic illness, classified as being in obesity stage 1, so not including people of higher weights, obesity stage 2 or 3, and also had a history of either an eating disorder or chronic dieting. So it's very important that when we're looking at this literature, it looks promising, and I think there's a lot that we can take from it, but at the same time, we have to exercise caution when we translate this to the general population, because we're looking at a very select group. Also, I don't think it's just with the HAES literature, but I think with a lot of the literature that we look at, particularly when it comes to weight loss, they tend to exclude environmental influences and impacts on healthy behaviors or implementing healthy behaviors. And so there's very much an individual approach. The literature states that a weight loss of 5 to 10% is associated with health improvements. And so people are encouraged to restrict their energy intake and increase their energy output. Guidelines also emphasize the importance of weight loss. Some guidelines actually state that the most effective treatment to managing type 2 diabetes is weight loss. But I will argue that it's statements like this that actually, when you focus on the number, when it becomes all about the number and suggesting that a certain amount of weight be implemented or exercised, that in itself perpetuates bias and stigma. And you might be confused by that statement and wonder why. Well, because guidelines actually drive policy within organizations, workplaces, and even amongst disciplines. And so when we consider that, guidelines are used to justify and give license to promoting weight loss and treating it as though it's a rule or a standard of practice, but we forget, and it's in the name, that these are guidelines and are really only one aspect of, hopefully, one aspect of how we approach clinical practice and caring for our patients. I also want to highlight, and this will probably, in the interest of time, I'll save it for the Q&A, but there are many limitations to the studies that are used to help inform and write these guidelines. And so I hope somebody asks me that question during the panel, because I'm not sure I'd have enough time. Okay. Government reports focusing on achieving healthy weights are also problematic and add and perpetuate the bias and the stigma around weight. And many of you may be familiar with this particular campaign this was run out of Atlanta, Georgia. Many of the campaigns, this is a great example of how fat panic is used, and like a moral urgency is basically instilled to, in this particular example, quite literally, fear was used to force the people of Georgia to do something about the fact that they have the second highest rate of childhood obesity in their state. And so if you take a look at the images, and I don't know if you can read the captions down below, but this is really stigmatizing the children, not only in this photo, but any child living in a higher weight body, as well as the parents of these children. And it really perpetuates bullying and stigma. The Ontario Medical Association also came out with this ad, suggesting that what we eat and drink is actually the cause and the culprit to chronic conditions like type 2 diabetes. Then we have campaigns that have the right intention. And so again, focusing on, offering rewards or incentives for people's efforts and trying to encourage healthy eating and active lifestyles. But again, when we look at these initiatives, they all come from the premise of either, losing weight or tackling the obesity epidemic, when I'll argue, don't we want health for all? Because when we segment and marginalize or target a particular group, then that's what leads to the stigma and the marginalization of people, and that's when people feel oppressed. So again, I want to highlight that while we're perhaps moving in the right direction, it's also just considering health for all, because we want health for all. Ultimately, when you take a look at any guideline, I'll say the majority, because maybe I'm missing one, but I doubt that. Most guidelines, most public health reports, they all emphasize on what the individual can do to make change, okay? This is what leads to guilt, shame, a lot of judgment on both parties. Again, the individual themselves, if they're not engaging in that in a particular helpful behavior, as well as other people judging them for not doing this. Self-blame, stigmatization. And one of the biggest limitations and criticisms that academics make with regards to, again, how we're approaching healthy lifestyles is the lack of consideration given to the social determinants of health. So accounting for people's socioeconomic status, their working conditions, the environment in which they live, they work, housing, I could go on and on. There are a number of factors that contribute to one's health, and oftentimes it's those factors that pose the barrier to implementing healthy lifestyles. But there's no consideration given to it right now when these are being developed. Obesity is considered a major health issue as defined by body mass index, which is problematic. I think everybody in this room will agree that there are problems with using BMI as a measure of health. It's a lousy measure of health. After all, we really know what BMI stands for. All right. I'm going to end by focusing in on healthy public policy and how HAES can fit into this. And I think I've been alluding to this already. So Ontario Healthy Communities define healthy public policy as having concern for health and equity in all areas of policy and being accountable for it. I won't bother reading off my next points. You can look at that later. But I do want to highlight that when it comes to healthy public policy, it's really about working toward equalizing the playing field so that everybody is at the front of the starting line. And then from there, people have a better chance of living healthier lifestyles. I love this quote, which was written by Tomiyama et al. And I think this is an important first step in addressing what we're experiencing today. The most effective and ethical approaches, when we're writing up guidelines or putting out public health reports, really should be about changing the behaviors and the attitudes of those who are actually doing the stigmatizing, and not towards targets of weight stigma. There are a number of recommendations that Phil et al. Have outlined in their paper, and it really resonated with me, and I'm including it here to share with you because as I read through their paper, it really aligned nicely with the HAES principles. And so, along with the recommendations that are listed in the next couple of slides, I've also included the HAES principles that these recommendations speak to. And the first is, number one, we need to acknowledge that fat stigma really is a population health threat. And I think many people, again, in this room recognize that. But this goes back to Angela's conversation, again, and some of the literature that was highlighted. This is really the literature that Rebecca Poole and colleagues is doing. The literature clearly states that fat stigma is what's probably causing more harm and is leading to poor health outcomes more so than people's being at a higher weight. Okay, so the first step is working on campaigns that help to reduce anti-fat stigma. Promoting health behaviors is the second recommendation. So focusing on health and not including weight as part of that measurement tool. And certainly we need to look at better tools for measuring health. And I believe Obesity Canada is looking at changing definitions and about that. And finally, I bring up the determinants of health once again. So if there is going to be equal access and health improvements, or even a chance at achieving a healthier lifestyle, we really need to consider the determinants of health. And that brings me to highlight the socio-ecological model, because as you can see here, yes, on an individual level, there's a role that we can play, but it goes much more in depth from that, which includes the social, the cultural, the economic factors that we know influence health on many levels. Family, other relationships, community, social networks, living conditions, working circumstances, and again, state, national, and global conditions. These must all be accounted for when guidelines are being created. I can't share or go through this presentation without highlighting the work of Lindsay Mazer, who's a registered dietitian in Manitoba. She has been lobbying the Manitoba government to include weight in their human rights code. And this is one example of how policy can actually provide protection to those living, or for those living in a higher weight, in higher weight bodies. Her movement, it's an online movement that was entitled, and that is entitled, #SizeismSucks. She's collected over 46,000 signatures across Canada. Now, the bill got to committee stage and then was voted down, but I do want to highlight that discussions continue to occur between politicians and advocates. And as we know, change is slow, but I'm encouraged because I do feel that a weight-inclusive approach is gaining momentum, just like we saw with these movements. So how can HAES principles advance healthy public policy? We need to make it about health and not weight. Government officials, they look to the experts. They look to us as experts working in healthcare and health promotion to help guide and inform them on policies that need to be or should be implemented. And if we're not consistent with our messaging, and if we're not looking at the entire body of literature or considering all the levels of the determinants of health, then we can't adequately address the health issues of our nation. Thank you.
So thank you so much for all those wonderful presentations. We have 3 minutes for questions, and we have all 3 speakers here at the table. So if you can go to the microphones, if you have a question that you're dying to ask our distinguished speakers. Anybody?
Thank you. While we wait for somebody to come up to the microphone, I actually forgot to mention something, and I just was having a little sidebar with Angela about it. So one of the issues I mentioned about the inadequate measures that we have for understanding about attitudes towards people in larger bodies. We have actually been asked at Dow to stop doing the training that we're doing, partly because the measures that we have are so rubbish that they actually potentially could be triggering. And so the baby in bathwater springs to mind. It's an important it's not the training as such or the workshop that's the problem. It's the measures that we're trying to use to assess its effectiveness. So we're in a kind of bit of a quandary because we need a better measure in order to be able to run the training that we're doing, which is actually having impacts on people's attitudes, beliefs, and also practice. So just wanted to kind of put that out there as another problematic area.
From the audience.
Hi there, my name's Lauren Vogel. I'm here from the Canadian Medical Association Journal. The question that I had, since you brought up guidelines and how there are limitations in the current guidelines that are out there around encouraging people to lose weight, that focus on weight, what are those limitations? Because I think a lot of the time physicians just sort of point to those guidelines when you bring up health in any
Yes, and I figured that would, thank you for asking, first of all. and I figured that would perk people's ears up. Well, when we take a look at weight loss studies, and especially, again, the studies that help to inform the guidelines, they too are of short duration, so oftentimes just lasting 2 years. We also know that most people will regain weight between 2 to 5 years. That literature isn't included, and it's not even acknowledged in guidelines, or at least most guidelines that we hear or that we read. Furthermore, there's all the literature on the obesity paradox, which again isn't accounted for. And we also know that there are multiple studies, particularly in the exercise physiology research, where we know that health gains can be achieved even in the absence of weight loss. And so again, I'm just curious, like I myself asked the question, why is there so much emphasis on weight when we know that health benefits can be achieved when people are focusing in on the behaviors? And what we've been speaking to today, we know the harm that's caused by weight stigma, and none of that is accounted for. Like if you take a look at Diabetes Canada guidelines and all of the other guidelines, that literature isn't included. And I think that's a major gap and a problem.
I just want to add to that. So luckily, the good news is that I just want to frame it a little bit positively now. But to say, we've been working on the Canadian practice guidelines for obesity. Probably a lot of authors actually in this room have been working on the guidelines. It's been a long process, but it's coming. There are new Canadian guidelines that are coming out, and we're really proud to say that we'll be the first country to actually address weight bias and stigma in an actual dedicated chapter for the Canadian practice guidelines for obesity. So stay tuned if we ever get everything done.
Thank you very much, and I know that there's a session due to start now, so I'm going to say thank you to the speakers, and thank you for your attention.
Great job.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was nice. We flowed, we were good together, all of us. It was a good bunch. Oh, I know, me too, I couldn't see. She's awesome, yeah.
Could the speakers for the Pecha Kucha session come up to the front, please?
So I have a question, because I have a time, like 20 seconds. Yeah. So like, you know, yeah. Okay, but like it won't. Okay, so it's like stuck on that one until
Until we press play.
play, and then okay.
Then it just goes. Okay, so
I hope it doesn't get cut.
So what'll happen is like I'll introduce everybody. You have 7 minutes. Once your slides end, technically you're allowed to talk a little bit more. But once your 7 minutes are actually up, I'm gonna wave you down, kind of. I'll be sitting here, so just keep a lookout for me. So Matthew Levy.
Yeah, Levy.
Levy, okay. Dana Lee Bagley. Darcy Leroy. Belwa. Yeah, Belwa. Okay. And then Theodore Kyle. Cool. So everyone knows their order. Everything's okay. Should we sit?
So what's our order?
Sit there. So you'll sit up here. Yeah. Okay.
And what's the order?
You will be last.
Oh, good.
Yeah. But we're asking everyone to sit up here.
Sure.
You are second. Yeah. So I'm just gonna give some quick introductions first. Great. Awesome. So you'll just sit up there, and I'll introduce everybody before they speak. Okay. Hello, everyone. We're just going to get started. So if you could take a seat, that would be great. Awesome. So welcome to the first Pecha Kucha session of the summit. My name is Amanda Rafool. I'm a PhD candidate at the School of Public Health and Health Systems at the University of Waterloo, and I'm also the outgoing chair on the Student New Professional National Executive this year.
Just a brief outline of the way the session today is going to go, because it's going to go pretty quickly, is that we have 4 speakers who have each prepared a Pecha Kucha, which consists of 20 slides shown for 20 seconds each, which means that each presentation is just under 7 minutes. I'll introduce each of the speakers before they come up, but I want to let everyone know that because the format's pretty quick, there's not going to be time for questions. Each of the speakers, though, complementing their Pecha Kucha, has created a poster, so if you meet them at their poster during any of the poster sessions, you can ask them any follow-up questions that do come up. So keeping that in mind, I'm going to bring up our first speaker, who is Matthew Levy.
Started. Yeah. All right, good morning, everyone. Hope you could hear me. My name is Matthew Levy, and I'm currently a master's student at Concordia University in the Department of Health Kinesiology and Applied Physiology under the supervision of Dr. Angela Alberga. Today I'll be talking about a study that my team and I conducted, which is called the Weight Bias Internalization, Sex Differences in the Relationship to Physical Activity and Sedentary Behavior. So I wanted to start off with this small cartoon that you could see. Now, although this is supposed to be slightly humorous, which it is, there are some serious undertones behind this because things like this actually happen. For example, when I was younger, I went to the dermatologist. She sat me down and told me that I had to lose weight, which was completely uncalled for. But in today's society, individuals with overweight and obesity are often exposed to stigmatizing experiences. This could come from, like I said, medical professionals, but this could come from family, friends, peers, teachers, really anyone, and could have some serious consequences. Individuals might actually internalize these negative, these stigmatizing experiences and believe them to be true in the form of something called weight bias internalization. This is essentially when individuals agree with the publicly held, usually negative stereotype surrounding individuals with overweight and obesity and apply these beliefs to their own capabilities. So I'll be talking primarily on the impact that weight bias internalization has on aspects of physical health. So a lot of emphasis has been put on the research indicating a relationship between weight bias internalization and physical activity avoidance, self-efficacy, and motivation. However, there have been some inconsistencies when looking at the relationship between weight bias internalization and physical activity participation. But what we do know, however, is that those who experience weight bias internalization are often deterred from performing physical activity, potentially due to a fear of being judged or not feeling confident in doing it. But regardless of the reason, it's quite unfortunate that those who may benefit the most from performing exercise may not feel comfortable doing so. We also know how dangerous performing excess sedentary behavior could be for both our physical and mental well-being. However, no known study has looked at the relationship between weight bias internalization and time spent performing sedentary behavior. Now, there's a difference between a reduction in physical activity and being explicitly sedentary, so we thought that would be an interesting variable to examine. So the goal of our study was to look at the relationship between weight bias internalization and time spent performing different intensities of physical activity, as well as sedentary behavior. We also wanted to examine if there were any differences between men and women, and this was done in a sample of Canadian adults from Montreal. So in order to answer these questions, we analyzed data that was captured as part of the compensatory health behavior study that was conducted at Concordia University's Incredible Perform Center. Now, the aim of this original study was to examine certain weight-related and lifestyle variables, such as the 3 variables of interest for our study. So in order to assess weight bias internalization, we utilized the weight bias internalization scale, where essentially higher scores are indicative of more severe weight bias internalization. In order to look at physical activity, we utilized the International Physical Activity Questionnaire, and in order to look at sedentary behavior, we used the Sedentary Behavior Questionnaire. So I'll first talk about the results we obtained for the entire population, and then I'll go over what we saw when we stratified by sex. So first, for physical activity, for every 1 unit increase in weight bias internalization, we saw significant reductions in both moderate and strenuous intensity physical activity. For sedentary behavior, for every 1 unit increase in weight bias internalization, we saw significant increases in both weekday hour and entire week hour sedentary behavior. Now, both of these analyses were done adjusting for age, sex, as well as race. When we stratified by sex for physical activity, for every unit increase in weight bias internalization, we only saw significant reductions in moderate and strenuous intensity physical activity amongst men, although we saw a similar trend, although not significant, amongst women. In terms of sedentary behavior, when we stratified by sex, for every unit increase in weight bias internalization, we only saw significant increases in weekday and entire week hour sedentary behavior amongst women, although we did see a similar trend amongst men. We also performed a subsequent analysis in which we adjusted for BMI on top of age, sex, and race. In this analysis, the results did not hold, which ultimately indicate that BMI or some weight classification variable could potentially mediate or play a role in this relationship, which ultimately warrants further study on our end. But I believe that the differences between men and women could potentially be rooted in differing levels of body dissatisfaction, which is often more severe amongst women. And body dissatisfaction has been shown to be associated to reductions in both physical activity motivation as well as self-efficacy, which could potentially explain why we saw more significant increases in sedentary behavior amongst women compared to men. Now, this study is significant because it provides a greater understanding of the workings behind weight bias internalization and how it can influence certain lifestyle behaviors. It also provides crucial, it also explains how crucial it is to avoid internalizing negative beliefs in order to basically focus on being the best person that you could possibly be. This study is also significant for healthcare and fitness professionals just to obtain a greater understanding of how weight bias internalization could actually impact certain physical health parameters in order to provide the best possible care for those who need it. So this study, the compensatory health behavior study, actually obtained 1-year follow-up data. So we're currently working to see how these results could potentially change over time, which would provide super interesting results, and hopefully we would obtain a greater understanding of this relationship. As well, I had mentioned with BMI, we're also now looking to see how self-perceived weight status could potentially interact with weight bias internalization to get a greater picture of these relationships. So I just want to go ahead and thank my lab members and my team. I want to thank you all for paying attention today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.
And so our next presenter is Dana Lee Bagley from the Nova Scotia Health Authority at Dalhousie University.
Oh, I did. Okay, so for anyone who knows me, sticking to 6 minutes is going to be a challenge, but we'll do our best. Okay. Oh, I did miss my first slide. Okay. So I'm going to be talking about obesity as a chronic disease and specifically listening to the voices of individuals living with obesity. So I'm a registered psychologist. I have a clinical position at the Nova Scotia Health Authority. I also have academic appointments at Dalhousie University and St. Mary's University. I'm the vice chair of the Halifax chapter of Obesity Canada, and particularly my academic appointments are actually in the Faculty of Medicine, in family medicine, and in surgery. See how good I am not talking? Okay. So in June 2013 and 2015 in Canada, the medical associations reclassified obesity as a disease. And in part as a chronic disease. Now, one way of sort of making sense of that also is that obesity is when extra adipose, or I like saying extra fleshiness, impacts health in some way. So this resulted in attention and debate about whether this was a good classification to define it as a chronic disease. And there were debates in the literature about whether that was a good idea or not. So those in opposition thought that it would lead to an over-reliance in medication and surgery to treat obesity, that it was simply in response to FDA approval of medications for weight loss, that it would shift away from the importance of environmental factors, and potentially increase the stigma towards those who have obesity by labeling it as a disease. In favor, it was that insurance companies might offer more treatment coverage, that it could lead doctors to discuss weight more with patients, to actually reduce the blame and stigma associated with obesity, and to provide more resources dedicated to obesity prevention and treatment. There is also not much done, but a bit in public perception. So despite a plethora of news reports of opinions from health professionals, there wasn't much from public perception. So these researchers looked at a sample of American adults and their perceptions about reclassifying obesity as a chronic disease. They found that in general, the majority of the participants in their survey found support for this idea of obesity as a chronic disease, supporting 11 out of the 17 statements, and in particular thinking that it would help access to obesity treatment. So what was missing from this, of course, was the patient perspective, or I like saying the real person perspective. So what we did was we asked people living with obesity about their perceptions of this definition of obesity as a chronic disease. So we did semi-structured interviews with 3 individuals living with obesity. It's a qualitative study, and it's part of a pilot project for a larger study on patient perspectives. So the common themes that emerged from these interviews, one was that it's not my fault. So that the reclassification removed some of the blame and embarrassment associated with obesity. They felt like it's not all in my head, and that they actually might be believed more by healthcare providers, that they actually are engaging in healthy behaviors, even if they have excess weight. It impacted their view of the biological influences of obesity, so recognizing that the brain is actually affected by obesity, that the body will defend themselves, and that the body has natural defenses to try and get back to a higher weight. They also felt that it would result in better treatment, so more than just advice to lose weight. Some recognized that they, in fact, had never been treated for obesity by a healthcare provider, and they hoped that it would result in more treatment options, such as medication or surgery. It also might result in focusing on more things that could be done, such as their health behaviors, providing more realistic expectations, and recognizing that it needed to be managed in the long term. So a variety of different impacts in terms of treatment. They also felt it might change attitudes, so provide less shame and judgment from healthcare providers, as well as discrimination from insurance coverage companies. So again, Viagra is often covered, but obesity medication is not. And again, better treatment plans than just their healthcare providers talking about calories in or calories out. It also highlighted the impact that their obesity had on their medical treatment, so missed investigations that weren't conducted because of the focus over reliance on their weight, and also the experience of avoiding healthcare because of the blame and shame that they had received from healthcare providers. It also helped them see that it was a chronic condition. One of them said, I'm gonna struggle with this for the rest of my life. Fostered a better understanding that it required long-term management, and they made comparisons to other chronic diseases and how they are managed, such as diabetes, that there's ongoing treatment and not a single intervention. It actually also motivated self-care. So by removing some of the blame and shame, they felt they were better able to take care of themselves. They were focusing more on behaviors that they could control instead of the number on the scale, and recognized that there was a long game that they had to play in terms of managing their health and managing their weight. So the limitations, a qualitative study, pilot study with 3 individuals. The participants were all advocates in obesity. So they had already heard of this definition. They had spent a lot of time with people who recognized this as a chronic condition. So the results may be quite different for people who haven't been exposed to this idea or spent time in this area. But it highlights the importance of the patient perspective. Overall, they felt there were more advantages than disadvantages. Many of them couldn't find any disadvantages to the redefinition, and also the importance of considering the patient perspective. And as we saw yesterday, Obesity Canada is very motivated in that area, and they have 100% of their committees have patient representative or real person representative. So that's all. Thank you.
Our third speaker is Darcy Valois from the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario.
Right, right, so hi everyone, my name's Darcy, and I'm currently working at Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario, and I'm a recent grad from the MA in Psychology program at Carleton. Oh. In Western society, the media portrays what is considered the ideal body type. Overwhelmingly, ideal body types are portrayed as very thin, toned, and muscular. Unfortunately, youth who don't have body types that are in line with this ideal may be vulnerable to weight-based discrimination. Weight stigma is a growing problem in Western society, with studies suggesting that weight teasing is one of the most common forms of victimization reported by youth. Although youth of all shapes and sizes commonly report weight teasing, those living at higher weights experience it far more frequently than their average weight peers. Undoubtedly, weight teasing can affect how youth see themselves, affecting not only their mental health, but their physical health as well. Recent longitudinal research has shown that weight teasing during adolescence has been independently associated with a higher weight at 15-year follow-up. However, mechanisms in this relationship are not well understood. Disordered eating may be a potential mechanism by which weight teasing is associated with weight gain. In response to weight teasing, youth may attempt to restrict their eating by going on a restrictive diet. Or they may also turn to emotional eating as a way to cope with any negative emotions that they may be experiencing. Youth engaging in disordered eating may inadvertently place themselves at risk for weight gain. For instance, restrictive diets are very difficult to maintain and often result in cycles of restricting, binging, and weight gain. In addition, emotional eating rates have been shown to be more prevalent in youth living at higher weights. This brings us to the present study. So the objective of this study was to examine whether restrained and emotional eating were potential mechanisms in the longitudinal relationship between weight teasing and BMI Z scores in a community sample of youth. It was hypothesized that both peer and parent teasing at baseline would predict higher BMI Z scores at 2-year follow-up, and this relationship would be mediated by or explained by greater restrained and emotional eating at 1-year follow-up. Data used in the present study were part of a large longitudinal community-based study called the Research on Eating and Adolescent Lifestyle Study. Participants were in grades 7 and 9 at the time of initial data collection, and they completed follow-up measures approximately 1 year apart. Participants completed the same set of self-report measures at each time point. Measures used in the present study included demographic characteristics, peer teasing and parent teasing collected at baseline, restrained and emotional eating at 1-year follow-up, as well as standardized BMI Z scores at 2-year follow-up. Correlation analyses showed that peer teasing, as shown by the numbers in the red box, were positively correlated with restrained eating, emotional eating, and Z-BMI. Parent teasing, as shown by the numbers in the blue box, was positively correlated with restrained eating but not emotional eating or Z-BMI. Lastly, Z-BMI, as shown by the numbers in the yellow box, was positively correlated with restrained eating but not emotional eating. Given these findings, the relationship between peer teasing, disordered eating, and Z-BMI were further explored in our main analyses. Multiple parallel mediation analyses were then conducted to test whether peer teasing at baseline was associated with BMI Z scores at 2-year follow-up, and whether this relationship was explained by greater restrained and emotional eating. Age, gender, socioeconomic status, and baseline disordered eating were all entered into the model as covariates. So for simplicity, I'll break down the mediation model by step leading up to the full model. So results of the mediation analyses showed that peer teasing at baseline predicted an increase in BMI Z scores at 2-year follow-up above and beyond all covariates. peer teasing at baseline predicted greater restrained eating scores at 1-year follow-up, but was not related to emotional eating at 1-year follow-up. Restrained eating also predicted an increase in ZBMI at 2-year follow-up, whereas emotional eating was not related to ZBMI at 2-year follow-up. So the tests of the indirect effects showed that only restrained eating partially mediated the relationship between peer teasing and ZBMI, which partially supported our hypothesis. So in other words, peer teasing at baseline predicted greater restrained eating at 1-year follow-up, which was in turn associated with a higher BMI at 2-year follow-up. So results of the present study showed that, consistent with past research, peer teasing was longitudinally associated with a higher BMI at 2-year follow-up. So these findings support the idea that weight stigma and blaming during adolescence is not only harmful to mental health, but also physical health in youth. Findings also showed that restrained eating partially explained the longitudinal relationship between peer teasing and ZBMI. So these findings add to the literature by identifying restrained eating as a mechanism by which peer teasing is associated with weight gain over time in youth. So this study was the first to examine disordered eating as a potential mechanism in the longitudinal relationship between weight teasing by peers and weight gain in youth. As weight teasing may be a modifiable risk factor for disordered eating and obesity, more effective weight teasing prevention strategies in youth are needed. Thank you.
And our final presenter for this session is Theodore Kyle.
Thank you very much, and I'm really delighted to be here to talk to you about why perceptions matter and how perceptions about obesity in the public are changing, shifting over time in Canada specifically. I have my disclosures here, professional fees, but I think it's also important for you to know that I have my biases. Everyone has their biases, particularly when the subject is obesity and nutrition. It's almost like a religion at times. The passion for the subject is so great. There are really two things that I want to accomplish here. I want to talk about why perceptions are important, and I want to talk about how things are changing in terms of perceptions about obesity in Canada. And I want to start by saying that bias really starts with how we think about obesity, that intellectual bias we have about the subject. And how we think about obesity itself flavors how we think about people who are living with obesity. We come into it with assumptions, and then those assumptions color how we look at people with obesity. And in particular, for a long time, people have thought about obesity as a personal failure. Well, I'm here to tell you that personal failure as a construct for thinking about obesity is an absolute dead end. It takes us nowhere. It leads us to false conclusions. And cultures differ in how they think about obesity. This is a study that we published in the Diabetes Journal here in Canada, and it shows differences between the United States and Canada, and it also shows, and it's also worth mentioning that those perceptions change over time. Well, we've been addressing obesity as a chronic disease now for a few years. It's in the US, the AMA declared it a chronic disease in 2013, and the Canadian Medical Association declared it a chronic disease in 2015, and that has important implications. Competing narratives about obesity fight for our attention. One of those competing narratives is that moral failure narrative, but something that's becoming popular and prevalent is the addiction narrative, and then there's the toxic environment narrative, and then there's the medical narrative. We collected data about these perceptions and identification with these narratives via Google surveys, which is a very efficient way for measuring public views. And so here's what we found. We found that personal failure, that moral narrative, is losing some traction with English speakers in Canada, but not so much with French Canadians, which you will see on the next slide. No, it doesn't. There we go. So that is, if anything, growing a little bit more intense. The 2 years that we're comparing here are 2016 and 2017. And then when we move on to the idea of obesity as a problem of addictive junk food, that is a popular narrative all over the world. Now, we haven't seen a lot of change in this in Canada, but it's worth noting that about half of speakers, whether they are English speaking or, here we go, French speaking, about half of the respondents say that this is a reasonable construct for thinking about obesity. Now, when you come down to the idea of an obesogenic environment, which among all of us who are drinking the Kool-Aid and thinking about obesity, that's a very important construct. It does seem to be gaining traction among English-speaking Canadians, but if you look at the responses of French-speaking Canadians, here on the next slide, you will see that it actually may be slipping a bit in terms of identification with that. Now, finally, we have the medical narrative, the idea that obesity is a medical problem. And sad to say that in English-speaking Canadians, the view of obesity as a medical problem is not really gaining traction. It's only about a third of English-speaking Canadians that say, yes, this is a reasonable representation of what the problem is. However, among French-speaking Canadians, we see that it is gaining some traction in that population. So, what have we seen here? A lot of data, and this is my first Pecha Kucha, but we've seen that the understanding of obesity is continuing to evolve. There are significant differences between French and English-speaking Canadians. French-speaking Canadians seem to be buying into the idea of obesity as a medical problem. The English-speaking Canadian view is shifting away from this idea of irresponsibility and more toward a perception of the environmental factors. But big gaps remain, so we must watch and we have to look for progress. And I want to say thank you very much. You can find more information here. I'm there on Twitter, and if you look at my Twitter feed, you'll find this link to my slides where you can digest all of those lovely graphs. Thank you.
So I'd like to thank everyone for attending and thank all of our presenters. Just a quick reminder for the judges to bring your evaluations to the front, and everyone else have a great lunch.